I found a question in your book that I liked, so you're definitely going to recognize this question. How did the civil rights movement transform the cultural trauma of Black people into a national trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question by Dr. Ron Eierman. He, I teach from his chapter on cultural trauma. So the first thing I think is we have to understand what cultural trauma is. And then how this is a collective experience that people have, being alienated or separated from their culture, which is what happened to African Americans. All right. And then that goes from their experience as a group, as a collective identity that defines them, to a consciousness that they all have about this collective identity, which took place in the civil rights movement. And that consciousness moving from that particular group to a shared national consciousness of us as Americans. Okay, so that's a nutshell, all right, a summary of where we're going to go with this explanation. So what is cultural trauma? Okay, we have indigenous populations, you have they're the only ones that didn't arrive here, we're going to say, pre-Columbian, okay? How they got the name Indians, because Christopher Columbus, thought that he had arrived at India, and of course he hadn't. Okay, so the pre-Columbian people, the indigenous populations that they were here, even though many of their tribes and their culture were decimated, they remained distinct identity, okay, and were able on these reservations to preserve their distinct heritage, identity, cultural practices, things like that. People that arrive here and immigrate to America, they're able to do that as well. African Americans did not have that experience. So the way we have become American has been so different than any other group. We came here by force, first off, a forced migration. Okay, now it's different if you came here from Africa or the West Indies and are Black and you immigrated to America later after slavery. Okay, they can claim a different experience in terms of arriving at their Americanness. All right, even though they're Black. But African Americans, and the way the term was originally meant to be used, were the people who are the descendants of slaves. And that's very important to understand, because you have Black people all over the world. I've got a son-in-law who's Jamaican, but he's not African American. So we're talking about the distinct identity of a certain group of people. Now, how do we get this identity? What makes us unique? Slavery, the slave experience, and the fact that our identity was deconstructed and reconstructed many times. That's important because that's where the trauma comes in. All right, so the first wave that you have come over from Africa, first off, they didn't call themselves African. They certainly didn't call themselves Black, Negro, colored, or any of those names. Okay, all of those names were prescribed, given to them by the dominant culture, by the government, to categorize them as a distinct population that was not going to become citizens of the United States. So originally in the American colonies, you had Blacks and you had whites. Many of them were indentured servants. Some were slaves that arrived from the Dutch West India Company. They all had the same status, though. After about 120 years, within the colonies, they set up black codes, and Blacks had been distinguished at that point from the whites. So they ended indentured servitude. They said Blacks could no longer intermarry with whites. This became a biracial society. Now, the United States hadn't fought the Revolutionary War yet, okay, but the society had already become biracial, meaning two races. black and white. That meant that other people who might have come from other places other than Europe got thrown into the black category. So you all became black. So they were either white people from Europe, everybody else was black. Okay? And you didn't have rights. Black people were also the ones, as I mentioned earlier, that were going to be enslaved. All right, so you had black people coming from all different parts of Africa. They didn't speak the same language. They didn't have the same identity. They didn't have the same tribal customs. First off, they saw themselves as tribes, tribal identities. Okay, Africa is the most diverse continent in the world. Right? It's got over 880 different ethnicities. Okay, so they didn't see themselves as unified. They were warring with each other. In fact, as the slave trade escalated, because who are you going to send to be enslaved? You know, your friends and family, or the tribe next to you. So it actually, for the demand for slaves actually escalated the war between the tribes, because, you know, they're capturing prisoners of war and sending them over to the slave catchers rather than their own tribal members. All right. So they did not identify themselves as black or as Africans. That came in the New World as the Europeans attached those labels to them. So they lost their language, their cultural identity, family, all of these practices as they were lumped together. The only thing they had in common is that they were from Africa and they were black. They started teaching each other language so that they could communicate with each other, and sharing some tribal customs and identity and practices that they had in Africa. But this is something, community, that they had to form themselves here in the New World. So just as they would get some sense of community, somebody would be sold off, ripped from them, killed, whatever. So you never had this sense of strong identity, because that was something that could always be taken from you. All right, so you had this process, this continual process of having an identity being constructed and then deconstructed, ripped and torn from you. Black people thought when the war ended, the Civil War ended, finally, they can't sell us anymore. They can't rip up our families. We're going to be Americans. That didn't happen. Okay? The promises that were made that slavery would end, well, slavery legally, formally ended, but that deconstruction of identity didn't. This is the trauma. All right, so when we talk about cultural trauma, we're talking about being separated from something that you once had a close affinity, something that you once knew and understood and helped define you, and you have that ripped from you. And as I've mentioned, that happened over and over and over again. Finally, after the war ends, Black people think, we're going to be Americans. Then they come up with this separate but equal bullcrap, okay? No, you're not. And we thought, hey, well, wait a minute, we're Americans. And they tell us to go back to Africa. We haven't been to Africa in 100 years. Right? The trauma that Ron Ironman was talking about was the trauma of being rejected from the only country they ever knew. Now, does that sound like what Chief Justice John Roberts was trying to protect with those kids who were brought over here as children with DACA? It's the only country they know. And you say that you don't think they're Americans, so you can just throw them back to wherever they originated, even though they never lived there. That's what African Americans were facing at that time. Some of them were saying, in fact, Frederick Douglass is like, don't even send me back to Africa. I'm American. Right? I have constitutional rights. We should have constitutional rights just as any other American. But that was some of the solutions that they were coming up with. Rather than try and integrate 4 million free Blacks, why don't we just colonize and actually some of them did. That's how Liberia was started, right? And eventually the United States turned that over to to the former free slaves, and they formed their own government afterwards. But some of them did do that. But the rest of them, that were here were like, no, we want to be American. So once again, that American identity was stripped from them. They formed political conventions and organizations, even though the majority of them did not have the right to vote, but they met in their churches. They had the Black Church, which was organized in 1816, decades before the war broke out, because you had a small free Black caste. Remember I talked about the colonies? Some of them were liberated then. Some of them were liberated at the American Revolutionary War, the northern ones, because the northerners said this doesn't go along with our values and our principles and our beliefs. We just fought a war to be liberated from England. We're not going to keep slaves in the north. So they didn't. But the southerners very much were against that. So you had the majority of African Americans still living enslaved, even though they promised them if, United States won the war, they would liberate. They didn't. And even after the Civil War ends, it didn't happen. So it's this constant, once again, having their hopes up that this is our home, this is who we are, and having that ripped from them. That's the cultural trauma that he's talking about. All right. They had the experiences of their slave ancestors, their parents and their grandparents that had shared these stories with them, and they kept that in the Black community. But they hadn't experienced themselves personally, this first generation, this freedom generation, the effects and the horrors of slavery. Their parents and their grandparents had. What they were experiencing was an alienation and a trauma from not being accepted as Americans because their parents and their grandparents' ancestors had come from Africa, even though they had never lived there. All right, so it's this recognition of this trauma that was being experienced not as a direct result of slavery, and it was shared collective experience, but as a consequence of their rejection from American society and not recognizing them as full-blooded Americans with all the rights, privileges, and benefits of an American citizen. That is what they wanted. All right, so they came up with a number of different philosophies and approaches to try and be fully realized as American citizens. And quite frankly, we are still going through that today. Okay, so you had one group that used a set of principles called moral suasion, where they said, kind of like the colorblind theory, we all have universal values, human values and needs that make us no different than anybody else. And if we just show that we work hard, behave ourselves, have good morals, right, then white people will accept us, right? They'll get rid of these heinous separate but equal laws. They'll see that we can be good, productive citizens, and we can be fully realized as Americans. So that was one approach. That worked successfully for a couple decades. Black people started becoming very wealthy and independent. And guess what happened? The reign of terror from the Klan and other white supremacist groups who were so upset that Black people showed their independence, they not just threatened them with violence, enacted violence, terrible race riots on these communities and deprived them of their wealth. Okay, and they had no protection under the law. You didn't see these things go through the court system. Okay, they just kept moving further and further west or out of the South, up into, cities like New York City, Chicago, things like that, to escape the violence in the South, or they moved further west to escape violence. But still, stuff like that happened even in the 20th century, Tulsa, Oklahoma, okay, in 1921. It still continued without any of these atrocities coming to trial. So you really didn't have the protection of being able to go to the courts and say, okay, the Klan has bombed our communities, has threatened our way of life. They didn't get that. All right, so you're still not fully realized as American citizens. The best way I can explain this, what they were going through, is that you don't have to experience the trauma directly to have that trauma impact you or to pass that on to your children. Look at 9/11. The majority of us Americans were not in the Twin Towers, nor where the majority of us have family members who were killed in the Twin Towers or were first responders. But we as Americans collectively mourned. And when September 11th comes around, we remember that day as Americans that collectively mourn that. And we share in that, even if we didn't directly experience ourselves the trauma from that. And our whole lives have changed ever since, right? We can't travel anymore the way we used to. Psychologically, it was very damaging to Americans, all right? Well, that's what slavery did, but not just slavery, after slavery, with not being accepted as Americans. That's what that did for African Americans. All right, as a group of people that became like this badge of not just an identity marker, but part of our collective experience, a trauma of being rejected, okay, because our ancestors came from Africa. That became part of our experience, what helped define us as African Americans. All right, other groups of people didn't have to do that. Well, people say, well, people came from Europe, the Irish and the Italians, and they were in ghettos. Yeah, that happened for one generation, because the next generation, because they were white and didn't have an accent, they were able to move out of those places and get jobs. Being black, all right, was the separation, the big separating divider, where people could still remember that, and just by looking at you, that you were a part of the group. This particular group that was, branded separate from the rest of Americans, separate but equal. And even on the 1930 census, okay, the one drop rule went full into effect. If you had one drop of black blood in you, then you no longer had a mulatto status, okay? It was either black or white, colored, Negro, whatever the definition that the government gave at the time to label and identify this group that was not on the same status as the rest of Americans. So that's the trauma. How do we become fully realized as Americans? All right. That became a part of the collective experience of Americans and part of our consciousness. The civil rights movement was an attempt to reconcile these two halves. We want to be proud of the fact that our ancestors came from Africa and passed on certain things, and all the things that they went through, and all the cultural practices and heritage that they passed on to us to survive, to be resilient, here in America, that has enabled us to carry on and endure the great injustices that we have as a people. That was one aspect of the civil rights movement, not just so that we don't have to sit on the back of the bus anymore and we have equal opportunity or rights in public spaces to go where we want to go, use the bathroom where we want to go, be able to check into a motel, those kinds of things, but also to embrace our heritage, where we came from, and not be ashamed of that. So for the first time, when African Americans, or black people here in America, right, descended from the slaves, had a chance to name themselves, that was the name that we chose. African Americans, to recognize, yes, we are Americans. Finally, they got rid of these laws that separate us, at least on paper, right, as Americans. And we also want to recognize this ancestry from Africa, which was rejected for so long, which was the reason why we're separated, right, from an identity and affinity and a nation and a country that we love. That's what the Black National Anthem is all about. This hope, these fears, these tears that one day we will be true Americans the experience that we had because our ancestors came from Africa, and wanting to be proud of both. There is no reason why we need to be ashamed of that heritage. And I tell students that all the time. None whatsoever. In fact, just the opposite. How many of you can claim to have undergone the constant deconstruction of your identities, being ripped and torn from home, sold, ripped from Africa, ripped from, home, sold to different plantations and things, and then after becoming Americans, having that ripped and torn from you, needing a civil rights movement 100 years after the war ends to say we're fully Americans. And as I mentioned, we're still doing that. What the civil rights movement did is it put it into the consciousness of Americans. Now, instead of this being just with this group of African Americans, all right, who we understand the trauma, we know because we've been passing it on, we've been teaching this history in our families and in the black schools. And the reason why we had the black schools and the black churches is because they rejected us. What were we supposed to do? Nothing? Just lay down and die? We formed our own. And they distinguished them as black to separate them from what was considered American. And people say, why do you have to identify and label things as black? Well, that's because the country rejected us. There would have been no need for a label of black if the country hadn't said, this group of people is not going to be able to associate with us, labeled black. All right? But instead of being ashamed of it, we're proud of it. We went through a lot to get to where we are today. And it didn't come because of the good graces of right people thinking, maybe we should allow them into our institutions equally now. It didn't happen that way. It happened because of the protests. It happened because we had to put it into the consciousness of American people how unfair this system was. That's what was needed. Okay, the civil rights movement did that. One thing that helped was the media and the television and Dr. King understanding if people saw policemen beating people just because they wanted the right to vote, beating people just so they could sit at a counter and get served the same as a white person rather than having to go around the back or to a window that was open for black people. Okay, if they could see for themselves the unequal treatment and the violence that white people were willing to enact upon blacks to keep them in their place, that would move the hearts of Americans to justice and action, to change at least laws that protected that racial discrimination and unfairness. And that's exactly what that did. Okay, that's how it moved from a collective consciousness and identity of just black people and African Americans having this experience in America into a national consciousness. When it's on the TV, in the media, in the news, every single day, and you can't escape it. And now you've got white people like Viola Liuzzo, white woman with 3 children who left her house to go down there to march, because she saw the humanity of these people wanting to do the same thing that she can do every day. Vote, shop, not have to worry about that. It moved people to action. Ministers from all different kinds of faiths, okay, and faith groups. It moved all kinds of people to say, these people are Americans. They deserve the same rights and access to treatment as Americans. It put it into the national consciousness. This made this an American problem and not just a black problem. Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's death is doing the same thing now. Putting it into the consciousness of Americans that we still have unfairness when it comes to how Black people are being treated within the criminal justice system, as well as housing, as well as healthcare. COVID did that. All it did was expose the inequity in our healthcare system. All right, Black people are dying, and Hispanic people are more likely to get the disease and die than whites for the same reasons that we see higher rates of poverty and everything else. More likely to be exposed to, polluted air, poorer diets, and less access to health care, and more likely to be, an essential worker that has to work at the grocery store and stuff like that, so you're going to be exposed. All these things are doing right now is peeling back the layers, so it's revealing the inequities, the systemic inequities that are still with us. They didn't have to plan it, it just happened. It was exposed. When that police officer in Minneapolis put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, the argument before was that we have implicit bias in how we respond to Black males versus other groups in our population, that we're reacting under duress, within a matter of seconds. And it doesn't matter if you're a Black officer or a white officer, you're making snap decisions and judgments that can affect and impact your life. All right? That didn't happen in this case. That's what was so horrific about it. You can't use that argument. I feared for my life and I had to make a snap decision. It was my life over his. Now, when you have your knee on his neck for 9 minutes, you had plenty of time to think about it. And this was a man who was not armed and not resisting. He had plenty of time to think about it. As that man is saying, I can't breathe, and then passes out, and still had plenty of time to think about it, and still didn't remove his knee. All right? So that blew that argument. It was witnessed all over the world, and not just here in America. It made it not just part of a national consciousness, but an international, global consciousness. You had Black Lives Matter movements and marches on every single continent. Why is that important? Because not only did people recognize how grossly unfair and unjust that action was and what Black people have been saying they've experienced, they also recognized the inequalities in their own countries when it came to Black lives. That's what touched them. Yeah, America is struggling with racism, but guess what? We're struggling with racism in Canada, in England, in Brazil, and other places too. And people recognize that all over the world. And you know what? That is what civil rights movement was actually all about. It was never meant to just be about, gaining rights for Black people here in America. It was about ending social injustice for Blacks everywhere, which came about as a consequence of the transatlantic slave trade. Black people were shipped all over the place and enslaved. That inequity is in other places too. Maybe not as bad here, and the reason why it lasted here in America longer is because of this notion of white supremacy, and we did the whole racial apartheid where other places didn't. Okay, South Africa did that, but they did that much. They didn't do that till after World War II, and it only lasted 50 years. And they patterned it after what we did here in America. So that's the thing, going from this trauma to a collective experience and consciousness among Black people themselves, to putting it into our national consciousness. And when it did that, the civil rights movement did that, by having this no longer be isolated to Black people, but making this a unified national problem that should bring us all together as we come to the table to talk about race and racism, what it meant in the past and what it means to us right now, and how we can move forward. And all I see what's going on right now is an extension of unresolved issues. Only one or two goals were achieved in the civil rights movement in the 60s. What Black Lives Matter and what's going on right now has just picked up the baton to continue the fight for social justice and equality. It's just picked up the baton. It's just a renewed effort.
All right. I think
now for our last...
take a breath. You want to take a breath, Angela?
Yeah. Take a breather, huh?
You have to break that up.
Yeah, I was thinking that. That's okay, because it gives you more videos.
It's good because it transitions into the last question beautifully, I think.
Okay.
Given that discussion. So based on what you just said, I think it does transition very nicely into the last question, which is, given the results of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, do you think a national policing policy would be more beneficial to African Americans than local level policing policies? This
is an excellent question. It's also a very complex question. That's why I said, oh my goodness. I'm going to try to make it down. Why complex? Okay, I mean, it's an excellent question because it ties those things together. As you mentioned, the civil rights movement, the voting rights, okay, with what we want to achieve today. The problem which makes it complex is this, which I'm going to articulate. Policing is not actually under the jurisdiction of the federal government.
Correct.
Okay, that's what makes this complex. This is an issue that civil rights desires to address because social injustice and inequity is embedded in our criminal justice system. Dr. King knew what he was doing when he was making a platform to put these issues outside of the Black community for the nation to observe, so that he could appeal to, the president, put pressure on Congress to make laws, okay, and then for the Supreme Court to interpret and back that up. So he understood that. Now the challenge with policing is that's not under the purview of the federal government. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive and fight for changes, but in this way, I say trying to adjust a national policy would be much more challenging and difficult, because what that means is you'd actually have to have an amendment to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, that would make that more like what President Lincoln did when he emancipated the slaves. Emancipation Proclamation was kind of like DACA. It was a temporary solution to a much larger problem. He knew that. That's why he said, you got to make an amendment to the Constitution, because next president can come in here and rip those whites away and they'll have no protection. Back again with John Roberts saying the same thing. You don't put a law in effect, these people have no rights and no protection. So you have to keep this into effect until there's a law that defines specifically the rights for this group of people. All right? So when slavery ended, we had that happen, and that came by way of the 13th Amendment. And that was really important because previous to the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Bill of Rights covered our civil rights, okay? And that was state by state. Same thing with marriage. State by state, right? So the only way you're going to change that to make it unified throughout the United States is an amendment to the Constitution or some kind of federal law which the Supreme Court would have to, if somebody wanted to challenge it, the Supreme Court would have to determine whether or not it was constitutional or not. Since they didn't have laws on slavery before or whatever, they had to do an amendment. In this case, we know, the same thing with policing. Policing is something that is part of the responsibility at the state and local level. So you definitely would have to have an amendment to take that out of the hands of, the states and the local municipalities to have the federal government be in charge of that. And then, of course, that would have to be determined if it was constitutional. That would be really complicated. I'm not judging and evaluating whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea, but we have to remember we have federalism, right? We're not just a democracy, but we have federalism, and then there's national supremacy, where the federal government actually trumps certain things that happen at the state level, but it also has to respect those things that are protected at the state level. So we have to work together, and if the Supreme Court has to decide on one, then it goes with the federal at the national supremacy level. So that opens up, all I'm saying is that opens up a whole nother can of worms, making it really complicated, since that is under the purview of the states. Now, at the same time, civil rights, because of President Lincoln and that first Congress afterwards, has made that the job of the federal government to protect. So we can go about it through that means, in terms of the federal government ensuring that these state and local police departments protect civil rights of all people. That the federal government can do. The job then has to be these conversations at the state and local level about how we are going to make adjustments in our policing. And I think that's actually a good thing, because they can decide then as communities. They have to have these discussions. They can decide as communities what we want that to look like in our community, what we want policing to look like. Now, what the federal government can do is make an outside body, like some kind of board or agency, that ensures police accountability for everyone. That they can do, kind of like an umbrella, to make sure that they are accountable for protecting the civil rights in their departments and agencies. That the federal government can do. All right? And then the local, state and local agencies themselves, put their own policies into effect. And then if there's a violation like what we've seen, we can take that to the federal government, or at least have a governing body that takes that responsibility out of the hands of the local police to judge themselves, yes, which is what's been happening, right? They're judging themselves, saying we're going to hold ourselves accountable. Well, let's take that out of the hands of the state and local, officers, and maybe have a body that separate from that holds them accountable to a standard that we can say is unified, and the individual state and local agencies come to some agreement as to what it's going to look like in their areas. That's a lot of discussions that have to take place, isn't it? That's a lot of work.
It is.
And to me, that's fair. It's more fair because they're being paid by taxpayer dollars at the state and local level. The taxpayers are going to have more say if it's directly involved in their communities than if it was at the federal level anyway, what they want that to look like. Okay, people have to come together at the state and local level, I'm saying, to outline what they want to see happen, and how that's going to be enforced. And I think we can have that separate body as an agency to hold accountable for the civil rights of individuals in terms of policing.
That makes perfect sense.
That makes sense? All right. Let's say this is you're asked a complicated question.
Thank you.
But a good question.